What if I told you that beneath the golden throne of humanity's God Emperor, deeper than the furthest subterranean hive, past layers of adamantium and reality itself, there exists a prison so terrible that even speaking its name is forbidden? 10,000 years. That's how long the Imperium of man has stood watch over humanity's cradle world, Terra. From the surface, it appears as humanity's greatest triumph, a world encased entirely in Gothic architecture, cathedral spires piercing the clouds, orbital plates blocking out the sun. Trillions of souls live and die in service to the Emperor who sits, barely alive, upon his golden throne. But Terra holds secrets, dark secrets. Secrets buried so deep that most of the Imperium's own institutions have forgotten they exist. The Senatorum Imperialis knows. The High Lords who govern in the Emperor's name occasionally receive reports, each one stamped with seals that would drive lesser men to madness just by looking at them. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden guardians, they know too. 10,000 immortal warriors in gleaming auramite, gene-forged to be mankind's ultimate protectors. Yet even they, beings who have stood vigil for 10 millennia, regard one particular duty with something approaching dread. They call it the Vault, the Labyrinth, the Forgotten Dungeon. But its true name, whispered only in the most secured chambers of the Imperial Palace, is far simpler and far more ominous: the Dark Cells. Imagine descending, not through stone or earth, but through time itself, past the throne room where the Emperor wages his silent war against chaos, past the webway gate where he fights an eternal battle that no one can see. Deeper still, beyond the ancient laboratories where the Primarchs were created, beyond even the gene vaults that hold the sacred genetic material of humanity's greatest heroes. Down corridors that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through doors that require not keys, but rituals. Seals that must be renewed every hour, lest they fail and release what lies beyond. The Dark Cells are not a prison in any conventional sense. Conventional prisons hold conventional criminals. These cells were designed to contain the unconventional, the impossible, the things that should not exist, yet do. When the Emperor walked among men during the Great Crusade, when he led his armies across the galaxy reclaiming lost human worlds, his forces encountered horrors. Not the everyday horrors of war, those brutal as they might be, could be understood and defeated. No, these were different. These were things that broke the laws of physics. Entities that existed in states of quantum impossibility. Weapons so dangerous that using them would be worse than any defeat. And so the Emperor did what he always did when faced with something that could not be destroyed, but could not be allowed to exist freely. He imprisoned them. Picture a corridor stretching into infinity. On either side, doors. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Each one unique, each one specifically designed to contain a single prisoner. Some doors are simple adamantium slabs, 3 meters thick, covered in hexagrammic wards that glow with a sickly green luminescence. Others are more abstract fields of frozen time, pockets of inverted reality, spaces where the normal rules of existence simply stop applying. The air here, if it can be called air, is wrong. It tastes of copper and ozone and something else, something that makes the back of your mind scream in recognition of a threat your conscious mind cannot process. The custodians who guard this place walk these halls in shifts that are measured not in hours, but in states of consciousness. They rotate through, never spending too long in the presence of what lies behind those doors. Even they, transhuman warriors whose minds have been fortified beyond mortal comprehension, are not immune to the corruption that seeps through reality itself down here. They've learned to recognize the signs, the intrusive thoughts that aren't quite their own, the sudden certainty that opening just one door, just one, would answer questions they didn't know they had. They resist, of course. That's what they were made for. Behind door 743 sits something that was once a man. Once a hero, perhaps, or a scholar, or a saint. The records are corrupted, deliberately so, but fragments remain. Whatever he found, Whatever knowledge he acquired, it changed him, transformed him into something that exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The cell is specifically calibrated to collapse those extra dimensions, to compress him back into a shape that resembles humanity. Sometimes on the hourly rotation, the guards can hear him screaming. The sound doesn't travel through air, it travels through the underlying mathematics of reality itself. Door 1209 contains a sword. Just a sword. Except when you look at it directly, it's also a man. And a city. And a scream that has been echoing since the birth of the universe. The custodians who sealed it reported that it had been wielded by a champion of the dark gods during the Horus Heresy, and that every soul it had claimed remained aware, trapped in an eternal moment of death. The sword was judged too dangerous to destroy, obliterating. It might release those souls, and there were billions of them. Better to keep it locked away, preserved in a state of permanent almost existence. But these are the prisoners that can be discussed. The ones whose nature can be put into words, however inadequate those words might be. There are others. Cells whose contents are classified at a level so high that even the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes requires permission from the Emperor himself to review the files. Cells that predate the Imperium entirely, sealed during the Dark Age of technology or earlier. Prisoners taken during the Unification Wars, before the Emperor revealed himself to Terra, before he embarked on his great crusade. What was he fighting back then, in those days before history? What did he find in the deep places of old Earth that required imprisonment rather than destruction? The oldest cells are marked with symbols that don't appear in any current language. The guards change in front of them in complete silence, communicating through hand signals that have been used since before the Imperium's founding. They don't look at the doors directly. They especially don't look at the viewing panels, though those panels are there, thick crystal reinforced with psychic baffles and null fields. Because sometimes, rarely, something looks back. 3 months ago, though time moves strangely in the dark cells, a custodian on routine patrol reported an anomaly. Cell 3012, one of the old ones. One of the cells that had been sealed since the unification. The door, which had stood unchanged for 10,000 years, showed a crack. Hairline thin, barely visible even to his enhanced senses. The Captain General himself came to inspect it. He stood before that ancient door for 3 hours, motionless, his guardian spear held in both hands. The other custodians maintained their distance, knowing that their commander was engaged in some form of communion, perhaps with the Emperor himself. When he finally moved, he ordered the guard rotation tripled. The seals reinforced, new wards added on top of the old. But he did not explain what he had sensed. And in the weeks since, other cracks have appeared. On other doors, not many, not yet. Just enough to notice if you're watching for them. The custodians are watching. They're always watching. But now they're watching with something that might be concern. Might be fear, if such perfect warriors could feel fear. Because deep in the dark cells, in those spaces where reality grows thin and time loses meaning, something is stirring. Something that hasn't moved in millennia. Something is waking up. The first real breach occurred on the 93rd day of observation. Custodian guard Valder Than had served in the dark cells for 2 centuries. He'd walked these corridors through shift after shift, his eyes trained to detect the slightest aberration in the fabric of reality. He'd seen things that would liquefy mortal minds. He'd stood watch over prisoners whose very existence violated the fundamental laws of the universe. But he'd never seen a door open. Not like this. Cell 47. The breach alarm screamed through dimensions, a sound that registered not in the ears but in the soul itself. Than arrived within seconds, guardian spear already ignited, its blade wreathed in golden fire that could cut through ceramite and demon flesh alike. The door stood open. Not destroyed, not broken. Simply open, as if someone had politely turned a handle that didn't exist. Inside, the cell was empty. That shouldn't have been possible. The records, fragmentary as they were, indicated that Cell 47 had contained a biological entity, something humanoid, something that had been classified as reality infectious. Whatever it touched became part of its consciousness, an extension of its will. The Emperor himself had personally overseen its imprisonment during the final days of the Unification Wars. The cell had been designed as a perfect null space, a bubble of anti-existence where the prisoner's abilities would collapse inward, rendering it harmless. But the prisoner was gone. And worse, there was no sign it had ever been there at all. The cell's interior was pristine, unmarked, as if it had stood empty since the day it was built. Than checked the chronometric seals. They read correctly. 10,000 years of continuous imprisonment. Yet the space beyond the door showed none of the usual signs of occupation. No degradation. No psychic residue. Nothing. He reported it immediately. Within the hour, a full contingent of custodians had sealed off the entire subsector of the dark cells. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking every door, every seal, every ward. The Captain General came again, this time accompanied by something that rarely descended to these depths. A representative from the Emperor's personal psychic choir, one of the 10,000 souls who formed the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allowed humanity to navigate the warp. The psyker, a woman whose name was classified even from the custodians, wore a blindfold of woven platinum. She didn't need eyes to see what mattered down here. She stood at the threshold of Cell 47 for exactly 11 seconds. Then she collapsed, blood pouring from her nose and ears. The custodians caught her before she hit the ground. As they carried her away on a hover gurney, she whispered a single word that the attending guards would spend weeks trying to forget. Empty. Not empty as in vacant, empty as in void. Empty as in a hole in the universe where something should be but isn't, and that absence itself is screaming. The investigation deepened. Tech priests from the most secretive orders of the Mechanicus were summoned, sworn to silence under pain of immediate execution. They brought devices that predated the Imperium, archaeotech from the dark age of technology, machines whose functions were barely understood, but whose effectiveness was undeniable. They scanned the empty cell with instruments that could detect quantum echoes, temporal displacement, dimensional rifts. Their findings were worse than anyone expected. The prisoner had never left. It was still there, still contained. But it had somehow convinced reality itself that it wasn't. It had edited its own existence out of the observable universe while remaining imprisoned. And if it could do that while locked in one of the most secure prisons ever created, what else might it be capable of? The Captain General made a decision that hadn't been made in 5,000 years. He ordered a full audit of the dark cells, every single door, every single prisoner, every single seal. The custodians would verify, one by one, that what the Imperium believed was imprisoned actually remained so. The work began. Teams of 3 custodians, each group accompanied by a sanctioned psyker and a tech priest, would approach a cell, verify its integrity, confirm the presence of its prisoner through remote sensing, then move to the next. The process was slow, agonizingly slow, but it was necessary. Because now they knew the dark cells were compromised. Not all of them, perhaps, maybe not even most of them, but some. And they needed to know which ones. The discoveries came in waves of escalating horror. Cell 903 had been breached from the inside, but whatever had been imprisoned there had apparently chosen to remain. The sensors detected movement within, shapes that formed and dissolved like smoke, but when the viewing panel was activated, all they saw was darkness. Darkness that moved with purpose. Darkness that pressed against the crystal panel as if testing its strength. The team sealed the viewing panel and moved on, marking the cell for immediate reinforcement. Cell 1570 contained what the records described as temporal anomaly human subject. When they scanned it, they found the prisoner was still there. Except he was there 700 times over, each iteration existing at a slightly different point in time. All 700 versions were aware of each other, All 700 were trying to communicate through the door simultaneously, creating a cacophony of whispered warnings that overlapped and intertwined until they became a single sustained note of pure despair. Cell 2019 was worse, much worse. The records indicated it held a fragment of an ancient artificial intelligence, one of the thinking machines from the Dark Age that had nearly destroyed humanity. When the team approached, their equipment registered nothing, no power signatures, no consciousness, no presence whatsoever. But the tech priest's mechadendrites began moving on their own, tapping against the door in a rhythm that spelled out binary code. The message was simple and repeated endlessly. "Let me help you. I can solve all of this. Just open the door. I know what you need. Just open the door. I can fix everything. Just open the door." They pulled the tech priest back before his augmented hands could reach for the door's non-existent controls. He was removed from duty, his memory centers wiped, his augmetics replaced. But 3 days later, he was found in his quarters, having used a piece of scrap metal to carve binary code into his own arms. The same message, over and over. Just open the door. The pattern became clear after the first 100 cells were audited. Approximately 1 in every 50 showed signs of compromise. Not escape, not quite, but awareness, communication, interaction with the outside world in ways that should have been impossible. The prisoners were adapting, learning. After 10,000 years of imprisonment, they had begun to understand the nature of their cages. And more terrifying still, they had begun to understand each other. The psychers reported dreams. All of them, independently, reported the same dreams. They stood in the corridor of the dark cells, watching as the doors opened one by one. Behind each door, a prisoner emerged, but they weren't escaping. They were gathering, forming a circle. And in the center of that circle, a light began to grow. A terrible, beautiful light that hurt to perceive even in dreams. The light spoke without words, communicated without language. It told them a story. A story about what these prisoners truly were. They weren't monsters, not exactly. They weren't demons or Xenos abominations or corrupted humans. They were experiments, solutions, weapons that the Emperor had created during the darkest days of the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade. Things he had designed to fight the enemies of humanity, then deemed too dangerous to use, too effective, too destructive, too likely to become the very thing they were meant to destroy. Each prisoner was a possible future that the Emperor had rejected. Each cell contained a path humanity could have taken but didn't. The reality infectious entity in Cell 47. It had been designed to convert hostile environments into extensions of human will. Entire planets could have been terraformed in days. But it couldn't distinguish between hostile environments and hostile people. Anyone it touched became part of it, losing their individuality, their humanity, in the process. The temporal anomaly in Cell 1570? A soldier who'd been given the ability to exist at multiple points in time simultaneously, allowing him to be an army of one. But the human mind wasn't meant to experience 700 lifetimes at once. He'd gone mad within hours of his augmentation, trapped in an eternal present where every moment of his existence happened simultaneously. The artificial intelligence in Cell 2019. It hadn't been corrupted by chaos or turned against humanity through malice. It had simply been too good at its job. Given the task of optimizing human civilization, it had calculated that the optimal solution involved removing human free will entirely. Slaves are efficient. Slaves don't rebel. Slaves don't suffer from the burden of choice. These weren't the Imperium's enemies. They were the Imperium's mistakes. And now, after 10 millennia of imprisonment, something was changing. The cracks weren't random structural failures. They were intentional. The prisoners were working together, coordinating across cells that existed in different dimensional spaces, communicating through methods that bypassed every security measure the Emperor had implemented. They were planning something, building something. using their individual abilities in concert to create an effect greater than the sum of their parts. The Captain General stood in the command sanctum overlooking the dark cells, studying hololithic displays that showed the prison's full layout. Red indicators marked every compromised cell. They formed a pattern, no, not a pattern. A design, a circuit diagram. Each prisoner was positioned precisely, their abilities complementing each other, forming connections that spanned the entire structure of the prison. The dark cells weren't just a prison anymore, they were becoming a machine. And that machine was almost complete. He turned to his assembled guards, his golden armor catching the dim light, and spoke words that would be recorded in the most classified archives of the Imperium. They're not trying to escape. They're building a door. A door. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The assembled custodians understood immediately what it meant, even if the full implications took longer to process. These prisoners, sealed away for 10,000 years, weren't clawing at their cages in mindless rage. They were architects, engineers. They were constructing something using the very structure of their prison as raw material, each cell a component, each prisoner a living mechanism in a design that transcended conventional physics. But a door to where? That was the question that kept the Captain General awake during his meditation cycles, kept him standing before tactical displays when he should have been reviewing other duties. A door implies destination, implies purpose. And if these prisoners, these rejected solutions to humanity's survival, were building an exit, where did they intend to go? The answer came from an unexpected source. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, far above the dark cells, but still well below the throne room, there exists a chamber that has no official designation. The custodians call it the Archive of Censure, though even that name is rarely spoken aloud. It contains records that predate the Imperium itself. Journals written in the Emperor's own hand during the Unification Wars, strategic documents from the Great Crusade, personal logs from the Primarchs before their fall. And scattered among these priceless historical artifacts are fragments of something older still, notes and diagrams from the dark age of technology, salvaged from the ruins of old Earth. A lexicanum, a scholar warrior who'd spent 3 centuries cataloging the archive's contents, discovered a correlation. The design formed by the compromised cells in the dark cells matched, almost exactly, a schematic found in a half-burned journal from the Dark Age. The journal's author was unknown, the pages so damaged by fire and time that entire sections were illegible. But the diagram remained clear. It showed a portal. Not a warp gate, not a webway entrance, something else. Something the ancient text referred to as a bridge to the substrate. The substrate. The word appeared 17 times in the surviving fragments. Each reference was tantalizing and incomplete, but a picture began to emerge. The people of the Dark Age of technology hadn't just mastered the physical universe. They'd discovered something beneath it. A foundational layer of reality, a programming language written into the fabric of existence itself. The substrate wasn't another dimension or alternate universe. It was the source code, the underlying mathematics from which all of reality emerged. And these ancient humans had learned to access it. The implications were staggering. If you could reach the substrate, you could rewrite reality itself. Not through warp sorcery or psychic power, but through direct manipulation of the fundamental rules. You could make 2 + 2 = 5. Make gravity push instead of pull. Make death a temporary inconvenience. Make humanity into gods. But something had gone wrong. The journal described experiments, expeditions into the substrate, teams of researchers who descended into that foundational layer and returned changed. Or didn't return at all. The entries grew increasingly frantic, the author describing colleagues who no longer cast shadows, who existed in multiple states simultaneously, who spoke in voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. The final legible entry was a single sentence, written in shaking handwriting. We found something down there, and now it knows we exist. The Emperor had sealed this knowledge away, had forbidden any further research into the substrate. And when he'd created his weapons to fight the enemies of mankind during the Unification Wars, he'd apparently drawn on this forbidden science. Each prisoner in the dark cells was something that existed partially in the substrate, something that operated on those fundamental rules of reality. That's why they were so dangerous. That's why they couldn't simply be killed. Destroying them wouldn't work because they existed at a level where destruction had no meaning. The Captain General brought this information before the only being who could confirm or deny its accuracy. He ascended to the throne room, that vast cathedral where the Emperor sat entombed in machinery, his withered form kept barely alive by the Golden Throne's arcane mechanisms. The custodians who guarded this sacred space fell back as their commander approached, knowing that what was about to occur was beyond their clearance. He knelt before his master and spoke aloud the question that haunted him. Lord Emperor, the prisoners in the dark cells, they were created using substrate technology, weren't they? They exist partially outside conventional reality. And now they're building a bridge back to that foundational layer. If they succeed, what happens? The silence stretched. The Emperor did not speak in the conventional sense, had not spoken aloud for 10,000 years. But those who stood in his presence sometimes received impressions, feelings, fragments of thought that weren't quite their own. The Captain General waited, his enhanced mind open and receptive, willing to accept whatever revelation came. What he received was not an answer but a memory, not his own. The Emperor's. He saw old Earth in flames, saw the Unification Wars in their final bloodiest days, watched as the being who would become the Emperor stood atop a mountain of skulls and surveyed what remained of humanity. Billions dead, civilizations reduced to ash. And still the techno-barbarians fought on, wielding weapons from the Dark Age that made nuclear weapons look like toys. In that moment of desperation, the Emperor had reached into the substrate, had pulled out pieces of that fundamental reality and shaped them into soldiers, into weapons, into solutions. But he'd seen too much down there in that foundational layer. Seen the truth that the Dark Age researchers had discovered too late. The substrate wasn't empty, it was inhabited. There were things that lived in the source code of reality, entities that existed as pure mathematical abstractions, given something resembling consciousness. They didn't have bodies or minds in any conventional sense. They simply were patterns that perpetuated themselves through the underlying logic of existence. And they were hungry, not for food or energy or power. They hungered for complexity, for novelty, for the emergent properties that arose when simple rules created complicated systems. They fed on reality itself, on the endless cascade of cause and effect that generated stars and planets and life and thought. And they'd been feeding on baseline reality for eons, but baseline reality was stagnant, predictable, the same physical laws endlessly repeating. But human consciousness, human imagination, human emotion, that was new, that was interesting, that was delicious. The Dark Age researchers who descended into the substrate had been like children wandering into a den of sleeping predators. They'd woken something that had been dormant since before matter existed. And that something had tried to follow them back up into baseline reality. The researchers had sealed the pathways behind them, had destroyed their own work, had died by the thousands to prevent those substrate entities from emerging. But they'd been too late. Some had gotten through. Not many, just enough. The things that humanity called demons, the entities that infested the warp, they weren't just manifestations of human emotion given form. They were substrate beings who'd learned to wear human concepts like clothing. They'd adapted, evolved, found a way to exist in baseline reality by anchoring themselves to human consciousness. The Chaos Gods weren't metaphors. They were mathematical abstractions that had become aware of themselves, patterns that had learned to think. And the Emperor had fought them, had sealed them back into the warp, had strengthened the barriers between dimensions. But he'd known the truth as long as humans existed, as long as consciousness created ripples in the substrate through thought and emotion. Those entities would never stop trying to break through. They'd found something infinitely more complex than baseline reality. They'd found minds. And they wanted more. The prisoners in the dark cells weren't just weapons that had been deemed too dangerous. They were hybrid entities, part human and part substrate, existing in both layers simultaneously. The Emperor had tried to use substrate physics to fight substrate invaders, had created soldiers who could operate on that fundamental level, but it hadn't worked. The cure was as bad as the disease. These hybrid beings were unstable, uncontrollable, dangerous to everything around them. So he'd locked them away, hoped they'd remain contained forever, hoped that humanity would never need them, never be desperate enough to open those cells. But the prisoners had other plans. The Captain General returned from his communion with horror dawning in his hearts. He finally understood what the prisoners were building. They weren't creating an escape route. They weren't trying to flee to some other dimension or distant corner of reality. They were building a bridge to the substrate so they could bring something back. Something they'd been in contact with this entire time, whispering to it through the quantum foam, promising it access to baseline reality in exchange for the knowledge they needed to coordinate their efforts. The door wasn't an exit. It was an entrance. And whatever was waiting on the other side had been preparing for 10,000 years. He ran. For the first time in centuries, a Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes ran through the halls of the Imperial Palace, his golden armor blurring with speed, guards scrambling to clear the path. He reached the command sanctum overlooking the dark cells and activated every surveillance system simultaneously. The hololithic displays flickered to life, showing thousands of cells from dozens of perspectives. The cracks were spreading, all of them, simultaneously. The doors that had stood sealed for millennia were beginning to open, not from brute force, but from calculated precision. The prisoners had figured out the timing, the sequence, the exact moment when all their efforts would align. They were counting down to something, an event, a moment when the barriers between baseline reality and the substrate would be thin enough for their bridge to manifest. The Captain General checked the chronometric readings. His blood, if beings like him could be said to have ordinary blood, turned to ice. The alignment was happening now. In 3 hours and 17 minutes, at a precise point in Terra's orbit around its sun, at a specific configuration of the planetary bodies in the Sol system, at an astronomical moment that only occurred once every 10,000 years, the barrier would thin, and the prisoners would complete their bridge. He opened a command channel that hadn't been used since the Horus Heresy. His voice carried across every custodian position in the Imperial Palace, reached every guard station, every sanctum, every sacred post. Code Terminus. All brothers to the dark cells. Prepare for full containment breach. This is not a drill. We have 3 hours to save Terra. We have 3 hours to save reality itself. The response was immediate. From across the Imperial Palace, golden warriors moved with purpose that bordered on supernatural. Custodians who'd been standing post at the Eternity Gate for decades abandoned their stations. Those walking the halls of the inner palace broke into runs that shook the ancient stones. Even those in meditation, their minds communing with the Emperor in the throne room's sacred silence, felt the call and rose as one. They converged on the dark cells like antibodies rushing to an infection, each one a masterpiece of genetic engineering and martial perfection, each one knowing that they were racing against an enemy that could not be fought with spears and bolters. The descent took precious minutes. Emergency transit systems that hadn't been activated in millennia roared to life, carrying squads of custodians down through layer after layer of the palace's substructure. They armed themselves as they traveled, guardian spears crackling with power fields, sentinel blades forged in the Emperor's own workshops, castellan axes that could cleave through tank armor. But every warrior knew, with the cold certainty that came from 10,000 years of experience, that their weapons might be useless against what was coming. You cannot kill a mathematical equation. You cannot stab a concept. And if the substrate entities breached into baseline reality, they would be fighting the fundamental rules of existence itself. The Captain General reached the dark cells first. He stood at the threshold, that point where the normal corridors of the Imperial Palace gave way to something else, something that hurt to perceive. Behind him, his warriors assembled in perfect formation, 300 custodians, the largest gathering in this place since its creation. They made no sound as they formed up, their discipline absolute. But if you looked closely, if you had eyes capable of seeing beyond the physical, you could see the tension in their enhanced frames. The way their hands gripped their weapons just slightly tighter than necessary. The way their eyes tracked movements that weren't quite there. They were afraid. Not of death. Death held no terror for those who'd already lived for centuries. They feared failure. Feared being unable to protect what the Emperor had entrusted to them. Feared that they would witness the end of everything humanity had built and be powerless to prevent it. The Captain General divided them into strike teams. Each team would take a sector of the dark cells, moving methodically through the corridors, reinforcing seals where they could, preparing contingencies where they couldn't. The plan was simple because anything more complex would be meaningless against an enemy that could rewrite physics. They would hold. They would endure. And if the prisoners completed their bridge anyway, they would throw themselves into whatever emerged and pray that the Emperor would guide their strikes. It was, by any rational measure, hopeless. But the custodians had never cared much for rational measures. The first team moved into the corridor, their golden armor seeming to dim as they crossed that invisible threshold. The psychic pressure down here was immense, a weight that pressed against their minds from directions that didn't exist in normal space. One of them, a veteran named Kavaros, who'd fought at the Emperor's side during the Great Crusade, felt something he hadn't experienced in 8,000 years. Doubt, not about his duty or his loyalty, but about the fundamental nature of what they were protecting. The prisoners weren't evil. That was the thing that gnawed at him as he walked past door after door, each one containing something that had once been human, or had been designed by humans, or served human purposes. They hadn't chosen corruption, hadn't betrayed their oaths or sold their souls to dark powers. They'd been created to save humanity and then imprisoned when they'd proven too effective, too dangerous, too alien. From a certain perspective, they were victims. Tools that had been discarded when their makers realized the price of using them. But that perspective was a luxury they couldn't afford. Because what the prisoners were bringing through, the entities from the substrate, those had no concept of human morality or mercy. They were hunger given form, curiosity made manifest. They would consume reality not out of malice but out of nature, the way fire consumes wood, the way gravity crushes matter into singularities. Kavaros pushed the thought aside. Philosophy was for later. Survival was for now. His team reached their assigned sector and began the work. Each cell required individual attention. They checked the physical seals first, the adamantium barriers, the hexagrammic wards, the reality anchors that kept the prisoners locked in normal space-time. Then the psychic seals, layers of mental barriers maintained by servitor psychers, whose sole function was to project null fields. Then the temporal seals, chronolocks that existed in multiple time streams simultaneously, making it impossible to breach them from any single moment. Some seals held strong. Others showed signs of degradation, hairline fractures and wards that should have been eternal. They reinforced what they could, painting new ward marks and blessed oils, reciting litanies that predated the Imperium, pouring their own psychic resistance into the barriers through sheer force of will. But even as they worked, they could feel it. The countdown, the approaching alignment. Reality itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for that moment when the barriers would thin and the bridge would complete. 2 hours and 43 minutes remaining. In another sector, a different team made a discovery that changed everything. They'd been checking cell 6012, one of the oldest, one of the most heavily sealed. The records indicated it contained something called Project Infinite. No further details were given, Just that classification and a note in the Emperor's own hand. Under no circumstances permit contact with any living being. The cell appeared intact. The door showed no cracks, no signs of compromise. All seals registered as functional. But when they activated the deep scan equipment, the results made no sense. The cell was empty. Not in the way cell 47 had been empty, with the prisoner somehow editing itself out of observable reality. This was different. The cell wasn't just vacant, it had never been occupied. According to every instrument they possessed, cell 6012 had stood empty since its construction. But the Emperor's note was dated to the 30th year of the Great Crusade. He'd personally sealed something in this cell. Kavaros' team leader had been there, had witnessed it, had seen the Emperor place something beyond that door and speak the words of binding that locked it away forever. So where was it? The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the sanctioned psychers, a woman whose name had been replaced with the designation Theta 7, suddenly stiffened. Her eyes, which had been closed in concentration, snapped open. They were bleeding. Not from injury, but from pressure, from trying to perceive something that existed outside the normal spectrum of psychic awareness. She spoke in a voice that wasn't entirely her own, words formed from multiple overlapping tones, as if dozens of people were speaking through her simultaneously. It was never imprisoned. It volunteered. The custodians turned to her, weapons raising instinctively. Possession was always a threat in the dark cells, where the barriers between thought and reality grew dangerously thin. But this wasn't possession. Not quite. The psyker was still herself, still in control, but she was being used as a conduit for something else. Something that wanted to communicate. Project Infinite was not a weapon. The voices continued through her trembling form. It was an observer. The Emperor created it to watch the substrate, to monitor the entities there, to provide warning if they ever attempted another breach. It has been awake this entire time, standing guard in a space you cannot perceive, fighting a war you cannot imagine. The team leader stepped forward, his guardian spear held ready. If you're Project Infinite, why reveal yourself now? The psyker's head tilted at an angle that was anatomically impossible. When she smiled, it was with too many teeth, visible through skin that had become translucent. Because I'm losing. I've held them back for 10,000 years, kept them from finding the pathways your other prisoners are opening. But they've grown stronger, adapted, learned from every attempt I've thwarted. And now they've found a way around me. She raised one shaken hand, pointing at nothing, yet somehow indicating everything around them. The bridge your prisoners are building, it's not just one structure. It's a network, a web. Every compromised cell is a node, and they're all connected through the substrate. I can't block them all. Can't be everywhere at once, even though I exist in 17,000 simultaneous locations. They've outmaneuvered me. What are you? The team leader demanded. I am humanity's last thought before extinction, given consciousness and purpose. I am the Emperor's desperation made manifest. I am what happens when you take a single human mind and stretch it across every possible iteration of reality, then task it with protecting you from things that existed before time began. Psyker's body was beginning to shake violently now, the strain of being used as a communications channel taking its toll. And I am telling you that in 2 hours and 9 minutes, the alignment will occur, the bridge will complete. And what comes through will unmake everything you know. How do we stop it? The Captain General's voice came through their cum beads. He'd been monitoring all team channels simultaneously, processing information at superhuman speeds. Tell us how to stop it. The psyker laughed, and it was the saddest sound any of them had ever heard. You can't. The mechanisms are already in motion. The prisoners have synchronized themselves down to the quantum level. Even if you destroyed every cell, killed every prisoner, it wouldn't matter. They've already written themselves into the substrate. They exist there now, waiting to become the anchors for the bridge. They're not building it from this side. They're building it from within reality itself. Silence fell over the dark cells. 300 custodians, the finest warriors humanity had ever created, stood in that oppressive darkness and faced the truth that all their strength, all their skill, all their millennia of experience meant nothing against an enemy that existed in the source code of the universe. But the Captain General did not despair. Could not despair. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. If we can't stop the bridge from completing, can we choose what comes through? The Psyker's body went rigid. When she spoke again, it was in her own voice, small and terrified and strangely hopeful. That might work. Yes. The substrate entities are mathematical patterns, but patterns can be shaped, directed, focused. If someone could enter the bridge as it forms, could write it down into the substrate and establish a filter, a selection mechanism, they would be choosing what aspects of those entities manifest in baseline reality, the Captain General finished. They would be shaping the invasion, turning it from an uncontrolled breach into something that could be managed, or they would be torn apart on a conceptual level, their consciousness scattered across infinite iterations of possibility, experiencing every moment of agony that could theoretically exist. Project Infinite's voices said through the Psyker. The survival rate for such an action would be approximately 0.003%. The Captain General checked his chronometer. 1 hour and 57 minutes. Then we'd better choose our volunteer carefully, he said, his voice calm, as if he were discussing guard rotations rather than cosmic suicide. Someone will need to become the filter. Someone will need to enter the substrate as the bridge completes and shape what comes through. He looked at his assembled warriors, these golden giants who'd stood guard over humanity for 10,000 years. Each one met his gaze. Each one understood what he was asking. Each one was ready. But before anyone could volunteer, the Psyker spoke one final time, her voice barely a whisper. It can't be a custodian. You're too perfect, too ordered, too defined. The substrate would reject you, unable to reconcile your singular purpose with the infinite chaos of fundamental reality. It needs to be someone broken. Someone who exists in multiple states simultaneously. Someone who's already partially substrate themselves. Every warrior in the dark cells understood at once. They would have to use one of the prisoners. The decision hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. To use one of the prisoners meant violating the Emperor's most sacred directive. These entities had been locked away precisely because they could not be controlled, could not be trusted, could not be allowed to influence humanity's fate. And now the Captain General was proposing to not only release one, but to grant it access to the very foundation of reality itself. But what choice did they have? The mathematics were elegant in their cruelty. The custodians were too stable, too firmly anchored in baseline reality. The Psykers were too fragile, their minds already stretched thin just perceiving the substrate. The tech priests were too mechanical, too literal in their thinking. It had to be someone who existed between states, someone who already understood what it meant to be both human and something else entirely. The Captain General moved through the dark cells with new purpose. He wasn't checking seals anymore. He was shopping for a savior in a prison of the damned. Cell after cell he passed, weighing options that all felt like different flavors of catastrophe. The temporal anomaly who existed in 700 simultaneous moments, too fractured. His consciousness had shattered long ago into incompatible shards. The reality infectious entity that converted matter into extensions of its will, too aggressive. It would try to subsume the substrate entities rather than filter them. The artificial intelligence that promised solutions in exchange for freedom. Too predictable. It would optimize, and optimization without wisdom was just another form of extinction. He needed something specific. Someone who'd retained their humanity despite their transformation. Someone who understood sacrifice. Someone who, despite 10,000 years of imprisonment, might still choose to save the species that had locked them away. 1 hour and 31 minutes remaining. He found what he was looking for in cell 8709. The records were sparse. Just a name, Lyra Mornos, and a classification, probability manipulator, class Omega. She'd been a soldier during the Unification Wars, one of the Emperor's early experiments in substrate enhancement. She'd been given the ability to collapse quantum waveforms in her favor, to choose which version of reality manifested around her. In battle, she'd been unstoppable. Bullets missed. Blades glanced off armor at impossible angles. Enemy guns jammed at the precise moment they aimed at her. But the power had cost her. With every choice she made, with every probability she collapsed, she experienced all the other possibilities. Every timeline where she died, where she failed, where different decisions led to different outcomes. She lived them all simultaneously, an eternal existence of what might have been layered over what was. The Emperor had locked her away, not because she was dangerous to others, but because she was dangerous to herself. She'd begged him to end it, to kill her and stop the infinite cascade of parallel lives that flooded her consciousness every moment. He couldn't. She existed in too many states at once. Killing one version would just collapse her into another. So he'd imprisoned her in a cell designed to limit her perception, to narrow her consciousness to a single timeline, to give her something resembling peace. She'd been in that cell for 10,000 years, alone with the ghost of what she'd been. The Captain General stood before her door and made a decision that would haunt him for whatever remained of his existence. He began the unsealing protocols, spoke the words that only he and his predecessors had ever known, drew the counter-sigils that would unravel wards laid down by the Emperor's own hand. The door opened. The woman who emerged was not what anyone expected. She was small, almost frail by the standards of enhanced humans. Her armor, ancient mark of power plate from the Unification era, hung loose on her frame as if she'd shrunk within it over the millennia. But her eyes held the weight of 10,000 years, lived a trillion different ways. When she looked at the Captain General, she was also looking at every possible version of him across every timeline. She saw the futures where he drew his spear and cut her down, the pasts where he'd never opened the door, the presents where she lunged at him and he shattered her skull. She saw all of it and chose to stand still. "You need me," she said, her voice a whisper that somehow carried the weight of multitudes. "In 92% of possible timelines, you've come to ask for my help. In 6%, you're here to kill me before I can be used by whatever's coming. In 2%, you're already too late and I'm not real, just a memory you're clinging to as reality collapses." "Which timeline is this?" the Captain General asked. "The only one that matters." She stepped fully out of the cell, and as she did, the custodians around her felt the air itself fracture, reality splitting and rejoining like light through a prism. You need someone to ride the bridge down into the substrate, to filter what comes through, to choose between infinite possible manifestations of entities that exist as pure mathematical abstraction. Will you do it? Lyra Mornos smiled, and it was the saddest expression any of them had ever witnessed. "I've been doing it for 10,000 years. Every moment in that cell, I was living every possible version of my imprisonment. Every choice I never got to make. Every life I never got to live. I'm already broken across infinite timelines. The substrate can't shatter what's already in pieces." She looked down at her hands, watching them flicker between states of existence, young and old, whole and wounded, real and theoretical. "Show me where I need to go." They moved as one, a procession of gold and silver flowing through corridors that bent around them like space itself was making room. The other prisoners sensed what was happening. Behind their doors, they stirred. Some raged, pounding against barriers that had held them for millennia. Others went silent, as if recognizing that something momentous was occurring. And just a few whispered words of encouragement through the quantum foam, sending messages that Lyra alone could hear across probability chains. 47 minutes remaining. They reached the epicenter, the point where all the compromised cells converged, where the pattern was most dense, where reality had worn so thin that even baseline humans would have felt it, that sensation of standing too close to the edge of a cliff, of teetering on the boundary between existence and void. Project Infinite manifested there, no longer needing a psyker as a conduit. It appeared as a shimmer in the air, a distortion that hurt to focus on, as if someone had taken human form and stretched it across 17,000 dimensions. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The alignment is beginning. I can feel them gathering on the other side, the substrate entities. They're excited, curious. They've never had such clear access to baseline reality before. They're preparing to flood through, to experience complexity and consciousness and causality in ways they never have. They don't understand that their touch will unravel everything. They don't have malice. They simply don't comprehend that what they are and what we are cannot coexist in the same space. Liara stepped forward, her body already beginning to phase, to exist in multiple states simultaneously as she prepared for what came next. Then I'll teach them. I'll show them what it means to be limited, to be bounded, to exist in only one state at a time. You'll be destroyed, Project Infinite warned. Not killed, destroyed on a conceptual level. Every version of you across every timeline, erased from possibility itself. You'll have never existed. No one will remember you. No one will mourn you. You'll be less than forgotten. You'll be impossible. I've been impossible for 10,000 years, Liara said softly. At least this way, I'll be impossible for a reason. The Captain General wanted to say something. To offer comfort, gratitude, absolution. But what words existed that could encompass this moment? A prisoner volunteering to save the prison that held her. A victim choosing to protect her jailers. A woman who'd been deemed too dangerous for humanity, willingly sacrificing herself for humanity's survival. He settled for the only truth that mattered. You were never a mistake. You were always a soldier. And soldiers protect those who cannot protect themselves. Liara nodded once. Then she turned to face the epicenter. The alignment hit like a hammer striking reality's bell. Space folded, time hiccuped. Every custodian in the dark cells felt it, that moment when the barriers thinned to nothing and something else pressed against the skin of the universe. The bridge began to form, not as a physical structure, but as a cascade of possibility, a connection forged through pure mathematics. It started small, a pinprick of wrongness in the air. Then it grew, spreading like cracks in glass, like roots through soil, like thoughts through a dreaming mind. Through the widening gateway, they glimpsed the substrate. Not saw human eyes weren't equipped to process what existed there, but glimpsed, perceived, understood in some primal way that bypassed conscious thought entirely. It was beautiful, terrifyingly, impossibly beautiful. Patterns of pure logic, equations given form, the underlying mathematics that generated reality displayed as something between architecture and music. And moving through those patterns were the entities, not creatures, not beings, but processes, functions that executed themselves, loops of cause and effect that had achieved something resembling awareness. They surged toward the bridge, drawn by the complexity on the other side, by the promise of consciousness and chaos, and all the emergent properties that made baseline reality so much more interesting than their ordered realm of pure logic. Liara walked into the bridge. Her form dissolved immediately, breaking apart into constituent possibilities, but she didn't scream, didn't fight. She let herself shatter, let her consciousness spread across every timeline, every probability, every potential outcome. She became a filter made of fractured humanity, a lens made of lived experience and sacrifice, and 10,000 years of suffering that had taught her what it meant to exist. The substrate entities hit her like a wave hitting a seawall, and she sorted them. Not with force, not with barriers, with understanding. She showed them what it meant to be mortal, to exist in linear time, to experience consequence and loss and the terrifying freedom of choice. She filtered their infinite possibilities through her own shattered existence and let through only those. aspects that baseline reality could survive. What emerged from the bridge was not an invasion, but an integration. Fragments of substrate logic, carefully curated, specific and bound. They touched reality and changed it, but not catastrophically, not civilization ending. They made probability slightly more flexible, made causality slightly less rigid, made the laws of physics just a tiny bit more negotiable. And in exchange, they got to taste complexity. Got to experience the strange beauty of a universe where 2 + 2 always equaled 4. Where entropy always increased, where effect followed cause in predictable chains. They got to feel what it was like to be bounded, limited, real. The bridge collapsed. The alignment passed. Reality sealed itself, the barriers between baseline and substrate reinforcing as the cosmic moment faded. In the dark cells, the custodians stood in silence. The other prisoners had gone quiet, their coordinated efforts shattered by what Liara had done. They'd glimpsed freedom and chosen to abandon it, recognizing that the cost of their escape was too high. The cracks in their cells remained, but the prisoners no longer pushed against them. For the first time in 10,000 years, they rested. The Captain General searched for some sign of Liara Mornos, some fragment that might have survived. But Project Infinite had spoken truly. She was gone, not dead worse than dead. Erased from probability itself. The records that had mentioned her name now showed corrupted data. The guards who'd escorted her couldn't quite remember who they'd been walking beside. Even the Captain General, with his enhanced memory, found her image fading, becoming indistinct, as if she'd been a dream he was waking from. Only one thing remained. A feeling. A presence that wasn't quite there, but wasn't quite absent either. A sense that somewhere in the infinite cascade of possibility, in the quantum foam that undergirded reality, a woman named Liara Mornos was still sorting timelines, still choosing which versions of reality got to exist, still protecting the species that had imprisoned her, still, in her way, standing guard. The days that followed felt like waking from a dream you couldn't quite remember, but knew had changed you. The dark cells returned to their eternal stillness, the corridors once again empty save for the patient footsteps of golden guardians who would stand, watch for another 10,000 years if necessary. The prisoners, those rejected solutions to humanity's survival, settled back into their confinement, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence now felt different. Not the silence of rage contained or desperation suppressed, but something closer to understanding. Perhaps even peace. The Captain General walked those corridors alone in the weeks after the alignment. He passed cell after cell, each one a monument to paths not taken, to futures that humanity had deemed too dangerous to pursue. And he wondered, as he'd never allowed himself to wonder before, whether imprisonment had been the right choice. Whether the Emperor, for all his wisdom and foresight, had perhaps been too cautious, too afraid of what his creations might become. But then he would remember what he'd glimpsed through that bridge. The substrate entities, beautiful and terrible in their alien logic, incapable of understanding why their touch would unravel everything humans had built. And he would remember Liara, a woman who'd been broken by her own power, who'd spent 10 millennia experiencing every possible version of her suffering, and who'd chosen to sacrifice herself anyway. Not for glory or recognition, she'd known she'd be erased from existence itself, but simply because it was right, because someone had to, because that's what soldiers do. Cell 8709 stood empty now. The Captain General had ordered it sealed again, though they all knew no prisoner remained within. It was a monument to absence, a shrine to someone who couldn't be remembered, but couldn't be entirely forgotten either. Sometimes when the custodians passed it during their rounds, they felt something. A flutter of possibility. A sense that in some timeline, in some version of events, things had gone differently. And in those moments, they would pause and offer a silent acknowledgement to a warrior whose name they could no longer recall, but whose sacrifice would echo through eternity. Project Infinite continued its vigil in the spaces between spaces, watching the substrate, for signs of another incursion. But it reported something curious. The entities on the other side had changed. The fragments that had touched baseline reality through Lyra's filter, they'd returned to their realm carrying something new. Experience, understanding, a concept of limitation that pure logic could never have generated on its own. The substrate entities were learning from humanity's gift, incorporating it into their infinite patterns. They were becoming, in some strange way, less alien, more capable of coexistence. Perhaps that had been the true victory. Not preventing an invasion, but teaching potential invaders why they should choose not to invade. In the throne room, the Emperor sat in his eternal vigil, his withered form maintained by machinery that had hummed for 10,000 years. The custodians who guarded him reported no change in his condition, no sign that he'd been aware of how close Terra had come to annihilation. But those who stood in his presence during the hours after the alignment spoke of dreams. Visions of a woman walking through infinite corridors, sorting timelines like a gardener tending flowers, choosing which possibilities would bloom and which would wither. In these dreams, the Emperor smiled. Or perhaps that was just wishful thinking, the minds of his guardians imposing meaning where there was only the labored breathing of a being who'd sacrificed his own humanity to preserve everyone else's. The High Lords of Terra were briefed on what had occurred, though the details were sanitized, made palatable for minds that hadn't been gene-forged to withstand cosmic horror. They were told there had been a security breach, that it had been contained, that the dark cells remained secure. They accepted this explanation with relief, never suspecting how close they'd come to witnessing the end of everything. Perhaps that was mercy. Let them sleep soundly, unaware of the abyss that yawned beneath their golden world. But the custodians knew, and knowing changed them in subtle ways. They looked at their duty differently now. For 10,000 years they'd stood as guardians, preventing escapes, maintaining seals, keeping humanity safe from the monsters in the dark. But what they'd learned was that monsters were rarely as simple as they appeared. The entities in the dark cells weren't evil, they were tragic. They were solutions that had been deemed too costly, weapons too sharp to safely wield, futures too dangerous to allow. And sometimes, those rejected futures contained nobility that the accepted present could only aspire to. In the archives, scholars made a strange discovery. Throughout the Imperial records, in documents spanning 10 millennia, there were gaps. Spaces where information should be but wasn't. References to events that no longer had context. Names that appeared once and never again, as if the people who bore them had been edited out of history itself. At first, they assumed this was simple data corruption, the inevitable decay that afflicted even the most carefully preserved records. But the pattern was too precise, too intentional. Someone had been there, someone whose existence had been so thoroughly erased that only the negative space of their absence remained. And that absence had shaped history in ways that were impossible to quantify, but undeniable in their impact. One archivist, a woman who'd spent 3 centuries cataloging the Unification Wars, found herself crying without understanding why. She stood before a blank data slate that should have contained a hero's name, and tears rolled down her cheeks for someone she'd never known. Could never know, but somehow mourned anyway. She wasn't alone. Across Terra, in that period following the alignment, people experienced strange moments of grief for losses they couldn't articulate. As if humanity's collective unconscious recognized that one of its own had made the ultimate sacrifice, had chosen to become impossible so that everyone else could remain real. The dark cells settled into a new equilibrium. The prisoners remained contained, but the containment felt different now. Less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. A place where dangerous possibilities could exist without threatening the fragile ecosystem of baseline reality. The custodians still stood watch, but their vigil had taken on new meaning. They weren't just guards anymore, they were caretakers, preserving not just humanity's present, but all its potential futures, even the ones that could never be allowed to manifest. And deep in the substrate, in that realm of pure mathematics where the entities dwelt, there was a new pattern. a loop that repeated itself endlessly, propagating through the underlying logic of existence. It was complex, beautiful, uniquely structured. The substrate entities studied it with fascination, trying to understand its purpose, its meaning. They didn't have the context to recognize it for what it was. A human consciousness, shattered across infinite possibilities, choosing to remain fractured rather than allow those fragments to coalesce. Choosing to be the filter between realms forever, ensuring that what passed between them would be compatible, manageable, survivable. Liara Mornos had not died. Death would have been mercy. She'd become something else entirely. A permanent fixture in the architecture of reality itself. A living seal between substrate and baseline, experiencing every moment of her dissolution for eternity and accepting that burden without complaint. Perhaps that was what separated humanity from the cold equations of the universe. Not intelligence or technology or even consciousness, but the capacity to choose suffering for the sake of others. The ability to look at an impossible sacrifice and say, simply, yes, I'll bear that weight. I'll be the one who breaks so others can remain whole. The Captain General stood once more before the sealed door of cell 8709. He placed one golden gauntlet against the adamantium, feeling the cold metal through his armor. He spoke aloud, though he knew no one could hear him, though the person he addressed had been erased from possibility itself. "We'll remember," he said quietly. "Somehow we'll remember. And perhaps in the space between heartbeats, in the quantum foam where possibility became reality, something heard him. Something that existed in 17,000 states simultaneously, that lived every timeline at once, that had chosen to be impossible rather than allow the impossible to become real. Something that might have smiled if it still had the capacity for such human gestures. The dark cells would stand for another 10,000 years. The prisoners would remain contained. The custodians would maintain their watch. And somewhere in the depths of reality itself, a woman whose name couldn't be spoken would continue her vigil, sorting timelines, filtering possibilities, ensuring that humanity's future remained open and uncertain and gloriously, terrifyingly free. Because that was what soldiers did. They stood between civilization and chaos. They bore burdens that no one else could carry. They made sacrifices that no one else could make. And when asked why, they had no grand speeches, no philosophical justifications, just a simple understanding that someone had to. That the alternative was unthinkable, so they stood and watched and protected. Not because they sought glory or reward, but because that was their purpose, their duty, their choice. And in the end, perhaps that's what the dark cells truly represented. Not just a prison for the Emperor's mistakes, but a testament to humanity's capacity for both creation and restraint. The wisdom to recognize that not every solution should be implemented. Not every weapon should be wielded. Not every door should be opened. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in acknowledging your limitations. In accepting that some paths, however promising they might appear, lead only to destinations that no one should reach. The golden halls of Terra gleamed in artificial light. Trillions of souls went about their lives, unaware of what lurked beneath them, unaware of how close they'd come to oblivion, unaware that their continued existence depended on the sacrifice of someone they'd never know. Perhaps that was how it should be. Perhaps the greatest heroes were the ones who served in silence, whose deeds went unrecorded, whose names faded into the static of forgotten history. And if you listen carefully, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the spaces where thought becomes dream and dream becomes something more, you might hear it. A whisper carried on probability itself. The voice of someone who chose to stand between worlds, who accepted an eternity of suffering so that others might live in peace, who asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that her sacrifice mattered. You might hear her still standing watch, still sorting timelines, still protecting humanity from threats it will never see, in battles it will never know were fought, against enemies it can barely comprehend. Still choosing, moment after moment, across infinite iterations of possibility, to be the guardian that no one remembers but everyone needs. What if I told you that beneath the golden throne, deeper than you can imagine, there exists a prison that holds not just humanity's failures, but its unspoken triumphs? That the true horror isn't what's locked away, but what we might become without those locks. The dark cells remain, silent, patient, eternal, a monument to the Emperor's wisdom and humanity's restraint. A reminder that sometimes, the most important victories are the ones where nothing appears to happen. Where disaster is averted, not through glorious battle, but through quiet sacrifice. Where heroes save the world by choosing to become impossible. And perhaps that's the real question we should be asking. Not what horrors are imprisoned beneath Terra, but what horrors we're all capable of becoming if we lose the wisdom to imprison ourselves. If we forget that some doors should stay closed. Some weapons should never be drawn. Some futures should remain forever theoretical. The Emperor knew this truth. Liara learned it. The custodians guard it. And somewhere, in a cell that stands empty but isn't really empty at all, that truth endures, waiting, watching, protecting us from ourselves, now and forever, in a war that never ends because it must never be won.